Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Holevoet, and I'm an engineer on Google's developer relations team. And we're going to talk to you today about building context-aware extensions for Gmail, a deep dive on writing Gmail contextual gadgets. So while I'm presenting here, we're going to use Wave and Google Moderator. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to open up this URL and enter those inside of the Google Moderator gadget that we have running there. There'll also be live notes, and so you can feel free to follow along. And if you missed the URL or accidentally close your tab, you can find this on the session site for this talk as well. So a brief agenda. Why contextual gadgets? Why are you all here? Why do you care about what I'm saying? Why are contextual gadgets great? And then what makes a contextual gadget? So the three pieces: gadgets, extractors, and the application manifest. How to test and distribute contextual gadgets. Common tasks and best practices that will help you along the way as you're writing these. An example application that uses contextual gadgets to sort of highlight some of the ways that these are used. And then finally, hopefully I'll have convinced all of you to go out and start writing these, so some tips on getting started. So first, why contextual gadgets? OK, so how many of you use Google Apps? Lots of hands. Yes, excellent. OK, how many of you use Gmail? All right, yeah, same number. OK, how many of you spend lots of time in Gmail? OK, yeah. So you can probably imagine that when you're in your Gmail, that you get tons of email every day, and a lot of those emails convince you to load up another window. They'll ask you a question about something, and you'll go off in another tab and look for something, and then you'll find it. Maybe you'll make some edits on a document, some other application. Then you'll come back and you'll send a response, right? This is a lot of different steps, and they all encourage you to leave your inbox. And if you're like me, you manage the things that you have to do by staying in your inbox. And so leaving your inbox takes up time. It's a little bit of a context switch, and it's generally unproductive. So contextual gadgets allow you to stay inside of your inbox and do all the things you have to do on your daily basis. So a great example of this is the Google Docs gadget, right? So you can see that here. I have an email from John. It's an important document, and he sent me a link to it, right? So I could click on that link, and I could load up Google Docs in a different window, read the document, maybe make some edits, and then come back and reply to him. Or I could use this Gmail contextual gadget, load up a preview of the document right inside of Gmail, read the document, do whatever it is that I need to do inside of that email or inside of that document, and then send off a reply to John, all without leaving the context of my inbox, right? So I save a couple extra steps here, and my day moves along a little bit faster than it would have otherwise. So what do these contextual gadgets do, right? So this is one example of one. Generally, they're matching on fields of an incoming email message, so who the message is to, who the message is from, the subject of the message, parts of the email message body, things like links or images. And then based off of those matches, they trigger a gadget to appear. And the context that we just matched in this email message then gets passed into the gadget so that you can do something useful, like display a link to a Google Doc and display the contents of that document. So what makes up a contextual gadget? So here's basically how Gmail looks normally, right? Or my artistic rendition of what Gmail looks like normally, right? And so this is what it appears like on a daily basis. You have your different labels on the left. You have a search bar on the top. And you're looking at this email thread, right? So we have this message loaded up at the bottom. We can read that, and we can do all sorts of things with it. So what happens when we add contextual gadgets to this flow? So I'm going to throw a bunch of terms at you. You don't have to remember all of them now. I'll explain them all in just a moment. But this is the basic idea of what's happening when we use one of these contextual gadgets. So this email message, the one that we're looking at the bottom here, is going to get passed to what we call an extractor. And that extractor is going to basically use a regular expression to pull out relevant bits of this email message. Those are going to go to a filter, which is basically a second layer of regular expressions to really hone in on the important details of this email message. And then finally, we're going to make a decision. Are there matches on this email message? In most cases, no. There's no match. So what do? We don't do anything. It looks the same as it always does. Gmail doesn't change. Your workflow doesn't change. You just have an email message. But in the case where you do have a match, those matches are basically the context, and that triggers the gadget, and that context is passed into the gadget. Right, so these terms that I mentioned, right? So each contextual gadget is made up of three things. The first one of those is the gadget itself. The second thing is one or more extractors, and I'll explain those in just a second. And then finally, because all of these extensions or contextual gadgets are delivered as part of the Google Apps Marketplace, we have an application manifest file, which basically describes all of the pieces of the application and ties them all into one application. So what are gadgets? Was anyone at my talk earlier today? Is this a refresher for some of you? OK, I'll try and go through this a little bit more quickly. If anyone thinks I'm going too fast, feel free to ask me a question. So gadgets are XML, HTML, and JavaScript. This is a really simple example of a gadget, Hello World. Hello World example is the title of the gadget. On top of that, we have some gadget-specific features that allow you to do things like adjust the height of the gadget, make it bigger or smaller depending on the content. We have some classes for fetching remote data. Those give us some helper features, like if we want to sign the request so that we know it's coming from Gmail, we can do that. We also get some unique information about the viewer, so a unique ID that we can use inside of our database. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then we have helpers for accessing data like JSON. If we request JSON inside of this method, we get back a JavaScript object that we don't have to do any additional work on to actually consume inside of the gadget. And then finally, the piece that makes this different from regular gadgets that you might have seen other places is this Google content match feature, which is basically what returns the context when one of these emails triggers a match. So the next piece of a gadget is the extractor. And extractors are essentially Perl-compatible regular expressions. I mean, it's the easiest way to think about them. And they come in two kinds, or two varieties. The first of those is the pre-canned extractor, where Google's actually done all of the work for you. So if you want to pull out a specific field of an email message, like who the message is from, or who the message is to, you can use a pre-canned extractor for that. And then the second kind is the custom extractor. So most of these pre-canned extractors operate on a single entity, right? So if I want to match in the context of an email subject, like if I'm looking for all the subjects or all the emails that have hello world in the subject, I can use the pre-canned subject extractor. But if I also want to know the subject of an email and then also who sent it, I really want to use a custom extractor. And the reason for that is that the normal relationship when you're defining multiple extractors is an or relationship. So it's if this extractor finds a match or if this other one finds a match. And a custom extractor combines those into an and relationship. So if this is the subject and this is the sender of the email, then trigger the gadget. And so these aren't actually available right now, but they're available very soon. And actually, for people that are in the audience today, if anyone is interested in testing custom extractors, come and talk to me afterwards, and I'll see if I can hook you up. So back to pre-canned extractors for just a moment. This is the comprehensive list of pre-canned extractors that we have available. Things like email addresses, the time an email was sent, HTTP links, recipients, and even US stock tickers if you're interested in pulling those out of an email message. And if there's something in this list that we're not offering, we're really interested in hearing what types of things you'd like to have access to that aren't available yet. And we'll see if we can add those to that list. So you might be saying, OK, well, a subject extractor is cool, but it looks like it's pulling out the subject of every single email message. And that would be true, right? So if you want to match on just a subset of all of the subjects of email messages, you can use what's called a filter. And like I was saying in my diagram before, a filter is basically a second regular expression that hones in on the specific things that we're really interested in looking for. And it's really straightforward to use one. So in this particular case here, this larger piece is the extractor definition, which will live inside of the application manifest. And we're specifying the field that we want to filter. In this case, it's the subject. And we're looking for every message that says hello world at the beginning of the subject line. So if we were to actually apply this to someone's inbox, we would only trigger the gadget when the subject says hello world at the beginning. As I said before, if you'd like to combine the results of multiple pre-canned extractors, you would write a custom extractor, and that's useful for defining the AND relationship. So this is an example of one of those custom extractors. This pulls out both the time an email was sent as well as the sender of the email message. And actually, if you wanted to then apply filters to these, you could do that. So you could say param name equals sender email and specify a regular expression for matching on that particular email address. So if you wanted to trigger on all the emails from a certain domain or certain sets of domains or everyone named Bob, you could do that inside of a filter. So the final piece of these contextual gadgets is the application manifest. And this is, like I said before, what defines the components of the contextual gadget. So you'd have definitions for the extractors, filters on any pre-canned or custom extractors, the gadgets that are triggered when those extractors find matches, and finally the scopes for data access. So for each of these fields of the email message, you have to basically indicate to the domain administrator that's installing this gadget that your gadget's going to be looking, or applying a pattern to the fields, or that field of an email message. So this is an example, or these are some examples of the different fields of the manifest. So the first one we're looking at here, this is a test extractor, and we're defining basically where the extractor lives. So this is the test extractor ID. We have a field here, and we're applying a filter to it. This is basically the same as what we were looking at before. We trigger a gadget, which is defined below. So we indicate that by this trigger field here. And then below, we have the definition of the gadget, which is basically a unique identifier for the gadget, as well as a link to the publicly available gadget XML. And then finally, we're declaring that this extractor uses a scope. So again, just like we referenced the gadget, we're going to reference a scope, which is available later on in the manifest. Actually, the next slide has an example definition of a scope. So in this particular case, we're looking at the subject line of the email message here. And so the regular expression and the filter that we declared for this would then look for matches on the subject lines and to trigger the gadget. And then below that, we're actually specifying a reason that the subject line is used by the gadget. So in this particular case, given that this is an example, it's not a particularly descriptive reason. But when the application administrator goes to install one of these contextual gadgets, they would see a screen somewhat like this. So for each of the scopes referenced in the manifest, you would see the definition of the scope. So something like mail, when the email was received, and then that reason field would display below that particular scope. And so that's the way for the gadget author to basically indicate to the domain administrator why they're interested in having any access to that particular field. So you know basically how these gadgets work. How do you test them? How do you distribute them? So the flow is relatively straightforward, and I spell it out on the slide here, but I can actually switch over to the marketplace and show you how you would install one of these. So I'm logged in with my test domain right now, and I actually have a vendor profile already set up. So we'll just click on this, and it will load. And all right, so I have a bunch of listings here. So I could create a new listing for my contextual gadget, but since I already have one available, we'll just load that one up right now. And you can see all the fields that I've entered here. So the first thing that's important, this is a product that is directly installable into Google Apps domain. So you check the first box here. You can pick a category for your application, give it a name, give it a summary and an overview. And then finally, you put in this application manifest into the field here. And this is basically the document that I was talking about before. So this is what gives all the scopes. This is what defines the extractors we're going to use. And most importantly, has a link to the gadget that's going to trigger when one of these extractors finds a match. And you can put in a price and terms of service. So don't blame me if it breaks, et cetera, et cetera. Probably want to have your lawyers think of something a little bit more rock solid than that, though. All right, so then we'll go back to the listing page here. All right, so I can then click on this. And if I were ready to submit this to the marketplace right now, I could click on this button. There's a one-time fee for listing in the marketplace of $100. But since I'm not ready for that, I can still add it to my domain. So yeah, normally I would just type in my domain here, and this would walk me through the installation flow, which I just showed you a second ago, one of those, that screen. So basically, it would show me the terms of service, it would show me the data that's being requested, and then basically at the end ask me if I'd like to enable the application. So I already have this application installed, so we're not going to do that here, but this is basically the install flow. So if you're developing for your own domain, I don't know if anyone here is interested in just writing contextual gadgets for themselves. Is anyone? OK, cool. So if you're interested in doing that, the flow that I just showed you is exactly what you need to do. And then once you have created your test listing, you're basically done. So you can install it on your own domain. You don't have to pay a listing fee. You don't have to publish it in the marketplace. You don't have to worry about like other pesky customers asking you difficult questions about anything. You can just install it on your own domain, and then you're done, right? So that's basically it. You don't have to worry about any other distribution or any other people trying to install your gadget. If you would like to sell it, though, like I said before, you hit the publish button, and hopefully people will start pouring in, installing your application on their domains, and sending you lots and lots of money. So hopefully the business case has now been made for why you'd want to write one of these. So you're probably eager to get started. So here are some best practices for while you're writing these contextual gadgets. So the first one of these is some notes on using extractors. So you should use the pre-canned extractors if it's at all possible, right? They're fairly powerful. You can do lots of things with them. And we've really tried to take all the hard work out of matching on particular fields. So use these if you can. If you can't, let us know if there's something that you'd really like to do that you can't do yet. A particular thing that you're trying to match on in an email, and it just doesn't seem like it's possible yet. So we'd love to hear that feedback. The next thing is to use the smallest necessary scope that you can while you're matching this data. So if you want to pull something out of the subject line and you want to pull something out of the sender email, don't ask for access to the message body, right? Every additional scope that you request access for is an additional roadblock that you're going to have to cross when a domain administrator is installing one of these applications, right? They may be comfortable giving you some access to the subject line and a sender, but maybe not be so comfortable with access to a message body, right? So don't ask for extra data, basically. And then finally, you should try and match on as few emails as possible. And you're probably thinking, well, I have this really great use case, but it involves matching on every single email message. Fair enough. I'm sure you do have a really great use case that does that. But there are a lot of other people that do as well. And it's not the greatest user experience when you have one email triggering 5 or 6 or 10 contextual gadgets all below that one email message. So just keep that in mind. So sort of piggybacking on that, some great tips for writing your gadget UI. So the first one, if your gadget doesn't have anything to show, handle it gracefully, right? So say you are matching on every single email message, but there's no data in your database, or you can't find anything about the particular field that you're matching on. If that's the case, collapse your gadget down, use the dynamic height call that I was just mentioning a few minutes ago, or show a little teeny descriptive message saying that there's no data for this particular message. Don't take up the entire UI saying, oh, sorry, I don't have anything to do, because you're taking up the precious user's screen real estate, and they're not going to appreciate that, and they may even go as far as actually uninstalling your gadget. And you don't want that, and we don't want that. So try and take up as little space as possible. Be kind to the user. And along those lines, it's really helpful if you provide an option to users to expand or collapse the gadget UI, and actually remember the user's preference. So if I have one gadget that's triggering on a whole list of emails inside of my particular thread that I'm looking at, it would be really great if users could choose to collapse those contextual gadgets that are showing up. And the next time that they load an email thread, they already start out collapsed. And the best way to do that is using the user prefs API. I don't actually have any code for that on these slides, but if you want to know how to do that, you can feel free to ask me at the end, and I'll live code something up for you. And then along all these lines, when you're talking about shrinking and expanding the size of the gadget, the gadgets.window.adjust height call is really your friend there, and that's the easiest way to do that. So for anyone that was here before, I talked about fetching data, so I'm going to really quickly run through this. If anyone has questions on this, yeah, feel free to ask me to expand on this a little bit later. So the way that we do this is using osapi.http, and this supports all of the HTTP methods. So in this case, we're using a get. You can also use post or put. And we're requesting data at example.com. It's JSON, so we're going to get back a JavaScript object. And because this is asynchronous, it's not going to block the browser while it's executing. So we're going to pass in a callback function that's going to handle the data when the data is returned, and then the gadget can do something useful with that. So this request gets made, proxies that request to the gadget container. That gets sent along to a remote site, whether it's App Engine, as it is in this case, a third-party site, your own web server, something else. You know, any site that's accessible on the internet will work fine here. The server sends back or receives a request and sends back the data. And finally, the data gets passed to the gadget. It's pretty straightforward. Along those lines, you can actually use the same flow if you'd like to do authentication of the currently signed-in user. And so the key for this flow is that we're adding the authz signed parameter into this request. And so what that basically does is when this request gets to the container, so after it's passed through beyond the user, so the user can no longer edit the request, you know, it's free of worry of being mangled by a clever user in the JavaScript console or anything like that. The container will actually append a unique user ID, which we call the open social ID, onto the end of the request. Basically mash all of the parameters in the request together, any data that's in the payload, and then cryptographically sign it. So this is using a shared secret between the gadget developer, you, and Google. So you're the only two people that will have access to that key. So the signature that's at the end basically signifies that none of the data was edited in transmission, and that the user that is identified is actually the user that's using your app, right? And so once this gets to the server can basically duplicate that signature process, basically mash all of the parameters together, add in any of the payload content into this. Basically, it's a giant string, and then repeat that signing process to make sure that the signature that results is the same signature that was passed along in the request. And then, it repeats as it did before. So the data gets returned to the container, and the data gets passed back to the gadget. So you say, OK, that's cool, but the open social ID is not particularly useful. What do I do if I want more than the open social ID? So this is fairly common. And because all of these applications are part of the Google Apps Marketplace, you're already using OpenID to do authentication for other parts of your app. So we're going to encourage everyone to use OpenID for authentication within a gadget. And so the basic flow for this is as follows, right? So we have the same remote data request here. It's signed. It passes in the open social ID to the server. And here's some pseudocode, Python-like App Engine code that you could use to basically use that open social ID. So we'll take that ID here. We'll do a query on the users table in our App Engine app. Basically, we'll see if there's anyone we've already identified that has that open social ID in our data store. And if there isn't anyone, what we're going to do is we're going to basically save that open social ID along with a unique one-time use token. So this could be a session token. It could be a random string, any value that you'd like, as long as it is unique and it only gets used a single time, right? So we save that into the data store. And then we're going to return to the gadget basically a status message, right? This user wasn't found. We've created a temporary table in our database, and it's identified by this session token. So that gets passed back to the gadget. And we'll talk about what happens next in just a second. In the other case, where you have already identified this user, you can send back a message saying, yes, we know who the user is. You can also pass along some data. Here's the user's email. Here's their favorite color, things like that. Whatever you've already collected in your data store, at this point, you can pass it back to the gadget and use it in your gadget. So what do you do? What's the next step when you need to do further authentication on the user, right? So you have this single-use token that's been passed back to you, and you know what the open social ID is of the current user. And so what you're going to do next is you're going to open up a pop-up window to whatever location you're using to handle OpenID for your app. All right, so this could be your own server. It could be a third-party service that does OpenID on your behalf. Whatever it is, as long as it does OpenID, you're good to go. So you open up this URL. You pass in the session token as a parameter at the end. And then the user goes through the OpenID process. And since this is part of the Google Apps Marketplace applications, in this case, OpenID doesn't actually require the user to do anything. You're already in Gmail, so the user is already signed in with their Google Apps account. So when they get to the step of doing OpenID, they're already authenticated. And because Google Apps Marketplace applications can also whitelist the realm that they're using for OpenID, you don't actually require an authorization step either. So this pop-up window will redirect itself a couple times and finally end up on your server with that session token appended to the end of the URL. And at this point, you know who the user is because they've just logged in via OpenID. So you have access to their OpenID, and if you use Attribute Exchange, you have access to things like the user's email address. And then because you passed in the session token, you can also look up in your data store the OpenSocial ID that is associated with that session token. So you know the OpenID, you possibly know the email address, and you know the OpenSocial ID, and you can save that all in your database. So at this point, you know everything you need to know about the user in order to do authentication. And then you can close the pop-up window. And since the pop-up was open from within the gadget, if you're polling to see when the pop-up is closed, you'll actually be able to trigger some new behavior once the window gets closed. So this is sort of a sanity check, sends a request off to the server to basically ensure that everything went the way that you expected it to. And if for some reason the user closes the pop-up window before everything finishes, you can throw a message saying, hey, you didn't actually authenticate. We really need you to do that just once, we promise. And then you can open the pop-up window again. Otherwise, you're all set. You can run your gadget as you normally would. So next, some tips on writing safe gadgets. So the first thing, probably the most important thing here, is to stick to the HTML and CSS specs. This is great for both security and compatibility of your gadget. So these gadgets will work across browsers. And the best way to ensure compatibility is by doing things as they are outlined in the spec. Along the same token, stick to safe DOM operations. Don't do things like document.write. Use supported event handlers and timers. And in order to help you along in writing these gadgets, we actually recommend that you use things like Google Web Toolkit, OpenSocial templates, and jQuery. So if you're using one of these things, that'll take care of most of the recommendations above. So just worry about jQuery. Don't worry about writing safe DOM operations. You can sort of trust what it's doing, and you'll be all right. And a little bit of a distinction between these gadgets and the ones I was talking about earlier is that Gmail contextual gadgets will be using Caja. So how many people here know what Caja is? Yeah, that's about right. OK, they're all Googlers. So Caja is basically an added layer of security for applications that live inside of third-party apps. And so what they provide is basically a whitelist of JavaScript, safe JavaScript operations that can be executed by untrusted applications. So for applications that already run inside of iframes, they're protecting against a smaller set of things, but there are still some things that an iframe doesn't protect you against that Caja would protect you against. And if you're really interested in learning more about this, you can go to this code hosting project or project hosting site here, code.google.com/p/google-caja, which will explain in some more detail. It's a little bit out of scope of this presentation, but more details than you can ever possibly want to know about using Caja. Basically, if you're using one of these supported frameworks that we've outlined, when we do turn on Caja inside of Gmail contextual gadgets, your gadgets will work. So if you use Google Web Toolkit, if you use OpenSocial templates, if you use jQuery, you're good to go. If you use something else, you might be good to go, but you might not. So good to start now. And finally, if you'd like to test any of the JavaScript that you've written, there's a Caja playground at caja.appspot.com where you can actually input some of your JavaScript and see how it cajoles, as it's named. So good things to keep in mind for now. And these are some examples of the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to writing JavaScript code. These are fairly straightforward. The last one in particular, you shouldn't trust things like redirecting the parent window to possibly untrusted data from random users or anything that's unsanitized. And that goes for things not just redirection of the page, but if you're displaying content, make sure that you sanitize everything that gets put into your gadget. So now let's talk about an example application that's using a Gmail contextual gadget. And if anyone was here before, you've seen this application a little bit already. And this is an application I wrote. It's called TickTrack, and it's a ticket tracking system. Basically, it uses Gmail as a ticketing system, so you can assign owners and statuses to email threads. And then there's some other gadgets that I wrote for the other session where you can see different dashboards and so on. Things like this, that give you a summary of activity inside of the system. So let's look at the application really quickly. I have it open in one of these windows. So this is basically the app, and we have a bunch of people that are working on these tickets. I can click on one, see the tickets that are assigned to me. App engine's taking a little time. OK, so here we go. These are all the tickets that are assigned right now. It looks like I've resolved all of them. That's great. And basically, the flow would be, click on one of these messages, see who it's from. You can unassign it. You can assign it to somebody. Basically, say you're working on it, and when you're done, you can finally hit resolve. And so let's talk about how TickTrack is using these contextual gadgets. So TickTrack basically specifies an extractor that filters on the list of recipients of an email message. So in this particular case, I have a ticket queue, which is basically a Google Groups email address. And whenever a message comes into my inbox that's sent to that list, I want to identify that as one of the messages that's sent to this ticket tracking system. And then I'd like to trigger the contextual gadget to appear. Once we're inside of the contextual gadget, we're going to take the sender of the email as well as the time the email was sent and ship that off to App Engine, and to basically use that to pull out information about the thread that email is part of, and send that back to the contextual gadget so that we can learn interesting things about the email message and possibly take some action. So this is a basic architecture diagram of TickTrack, and it's the familiar extractor filter flow here on the right. When there's matches, we trigger the gadget. The gadget sends information to App Engine. On the side here, we have email from these groups being sent into App Engine as well, so that we can perform the matching between the emails and the threads that they're part of. Excuse me. And then finally, we're sending the thread details back. So yeah, so let's look at this in action. So here I am. I'm in my inbox, and I have these two threads that look like they need an answer. So first one of these will open up. It's a tricky question. Does P equal NP? That is a tricky question. And we can see below here, we have TickTrack being triggered, so we can see that the message is new. This is basically, it's unopened. On the right side, we have it's unassigned, so no one's working on this. Can't imagine why. And it looks like we need to take some action. I really don't want this in my inbox, so let's deal with this. Let's triage this ticket. So I don't think I can answer this one, so I'm going to pass it to one of my colleagues. So I'll just type his username in there, and then I'll assign it. So at this point, I haven't left my inbox. I've assigned the email message. Basically, I'm done triaging, and I can just take it out of the follow-up label, and we're done. So when Ryan comes in later, he'll see that he has a ticket to work on, and he can get work on solving that vital question. So the next one, simple question. Oh, this is much better. So we can see here, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? Ooh, no one's working on this one yet. This is excellent. So I'll just take this one here. I think I can answer this with another question, actually. So let's see, African or European. We'll send that off. And we're done. So I can mark it as resolved and remove the label. And we're finished editing all these tickets. So I didn't have to leave my inbox. I could see that no one was working on a message. I could basically identify that I was working on a message or assign it to someone else. send off the email when I'm done, when the ticket's resolved, I can mark it as resolved. And I basically completed this entire workflow in a couple seconds without ever leaving the context of the particular email message. All right, applause. This is excellent. All right, so how are we doing this? All right, so the first step, we're using the matches. And this is really just boilerplate code. You can actually copy this into your own contextual gadgets and just start using it. And basically what this is going to do is use this API call and get back an object that has fields for each of the things that we're pulling out. So in this particular case, I'm looking at the time the email was sent, as well as who sent the email. So I'm going to get context.timesent and context.sender. And I can use those in the app. It's really convenient. So once we have those two fields, we can use this method that I wrote here called getThreadFromDetails, which will take that context, pass it into the method here. This is another asynchronous call that's going to send off a request to App Engine. And basically, the result that we're going to get back is some sort of thread ID. So this is going to construct a payload that's something like the following here. This is just basically some JSON, not particularly interesting. But if you're interested in writing an API similar to this that takes inputs like this, there's actually a really great article on code.google.com in the App Engine section about writing RPC APIs on App Engine, which is really great for gadgets like this. And I can find the URL if anyone's interested in that after the talk. So this will send the request off to App Engine. We'll get back some data. And then we can display those buttons or the little status bar for each of the tickets. So that's really straightforward. The rest of it's basically just writing some UI code. And then the other interesting piece here is that in the application manifest, we need to declare the details of this particular application. So I'm using a custom extractor here because I want to match only when we know the recipient is in the list of addresses that we want to match upon. And then I'm also interested in collecting the sender of the email as well as when the email was sent. So here we have the custom extractor. We're triggering a tick track gadget, which we'll see in a second. We're filtering on the recipient to email address here. So this is a regular expression for matching on my mailing list. And then finally, we're declaring the 3 scopes that are being used by the gadget. So that's the time sent and the time received, as well as the recipients of the email. So this is the definition of the gadget. Super straightforward. Basically, just have to make sure that this ID matches up with what we declared earlier. And then this is the gadget XML. And then there's 3 of these scopes. This is just the first one of those 3. They're basically all the same. We give a we give the description of the or basically a unique name for this scope. We have a field definition here for the particular scope that we're interested in looking at. You don't have to memorize these or sort of figure out what they all mean. We have a list of them in our documentation, and you can just copy and paste. And then finally, we have a reason field. We're extracting the time sent because we need to perform email lookup. So relatively straightforward. So hopefully that seems relatively simple. You guys seem to like it. So hopefully you all want to get started at this point. So I'm happy to say that we launched contextual gadgets on Tuesday. So you're all free to start developing these today. We have documentation on code.google.com/APIs/Gmail/gadgets/contextual. It's nice and hierarchical. We also have documentation on the marketplace. So if you're interested in writing applications that use other parts of the Google Apps Marketplace, you can feel free to check that out. And then we have a developer forum for writing gadgets that live inside of Google Apps, this URL here. And thank you all for coming to this last session of Google I/O. It's a little bit late in the day, so I'm happy you all stuck around and came to this. But there were lots of other enterprise sessions as well, so I'd really encourage everyone to check those out too, and they'll all be posted online. And one thing that's not mentioned in here is that I'd like to give a huge shout out to all the people that launched contextual gadgets with us on Tuesday. These are really great. And if anyone wants to see some really great ways to use contextual gadgets, I'd encourage you to go to bit.ly/getcontextual, and you can see all the integrations in the Google Apps Marketplace. So these are really awesome. And without further ado, we will go to questions. Let's see. I thought there was a question here before. I'll just refresh. And yeah, if anyone has live questions, feel free to use the mics too.
Actually, I would like to know a bit of a limitation of the tool that you just showed us. Basically, can I redo some kind of AdSense? If you see what I mean.
So pull out context from an email message and then trigger ads?
Right.
You technically could. Let's just leave it at that right now. I can get you the legal answer perhaps if you give me your email address.
Okay, thanks.
Is it possible to have sort of like configurable extractors? Like, for the gadget you made, it's like, at my mailing list at, your company.com. But what if I'm in a different company or have a different mailing list name? Is there some support for something like that?
Right. So right now, the answer is no. But we're looking at ways that you could possibly do something like that. So if you have a list somewhere that you want to specify all the mailing lists that you'd be interested in matching on, have some way to specify an extractor that looks at that list. But we don't have anything like that yet.
Thanks.
Yeah. Hey.
Hello again. You mentioned some shared secrets and signing for some of your encryption stuff.
Yep.
Do you have any more details about that? Like what sort of encryption, revocation policies, expiration policies of the keys?
So if you're concerned with using a shared secret, you can also do RSA. So that's probably the best thing to do in that particular case. And
cool.
So we publish a key, and you can just use that for all the signing.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Question?
All right. Going to your YouTube example, that's all about what the recipient of the email sees. What do you have to say about what the authoring experience might be? I mean, obviously, if it's a link to a YouTube URL, it's cutting and paste the URL. But if you're in the Gmail editor, seems kind of limp.
Yeah. So right now, these are operating strictly on the recipient side. We don't have contextual gadgets for authoring. Maybe we will. I don't have anything in particular in mind for that right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you will be asking the Android mobile client to include these kind of features.
Right. So right now, these won't work inside of the mobile app. I think it would be really cool if they did. So we'll see what we can do. Yep.
Hi. Does it mean that the gadget will only hook to the emails inside the inbox, or it will hook also inside emails to the other folders, including compose message?
So during composition, it won't show up. But if I go to any other email that I've received, it'll basically do the matching process.
Including the trash also?
Sorry?
Inside the trash, email in the trash, inside the send email?
It might not show up in the trash, actually, as a performance thing, just because it seems like a good place to optimize. But if you send an email message, you should see a contextual gadget trigger on that as it normally would. So after you've sent it, if you go back to your sent mail and load up one of the emails that you've sent, if that would trigger a contextual gadget, it should show up.
Any plan to hook up the gadget for the compose message also?
There's no particular plan that I can share right now. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Just a quick, question or request. In the standard built-in ones, can we have an arbitrary header match? So if I wanted references, for example, because I knew it was an email that came initially from me or had been tagged in a certain way with the message ID, that I could use that as a filter?
Right. So right now, there is not a way to do that on an arbitrary header. We could certainly look into doing something like that, and we'd have to figure out the right way to message that inside of the scopes so that the domain administrator knows what types of things you're trying to extract.
Yeah, no worries.
So hi, I was wondering, you mentioned GWT as a tool to write gadgets. Having gone through the experience of using GWT for writing iGoogle gadgets and breaking a few teeth on that, I was wondering if has anyone actually written gadgets for contextual gadgets in GWT?
Yes, I believe that there are some people here that have actually written contextual gadgets in GWT and can speak to that. Yes, there they are in the back.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. And by the way, the header thing would be great.
Yep.
Some header match.
Yeah, we've gotten that feedback from a bunch of people, so we're looking to that.
Cool.
Yeah, I guess then I should do some of the.
How would all this handle privacy, right? So if my boss, who is the controller of the Google Apps, would enforce all users to use a specific gadget that would eavesdrop on all emails and send CCs to him so he can read, or maybe even trigger on his own name or sexual references, I don't know. How would you do that?
Right, so to be very clear about this, the domain administrator is really the one that's making the decision about what gadgets to install. And so hopefully your domain administrator is the right person to be making that decision, but that's where the decision's being made. So Google's not installing any of these on your domain's account, and we're not going to match on things like that. So your domain administrator should make sure that they understand what they're doing before they click the button.
Okay, I understand.
It might have been today or very recently, yeah. Yes. All right, so repeating the question for people who are watching the video, can you use the contextual gadget for basically as a target to drop things from other places? So you could do that. I mean, if you're using like HTML5 or something, you can do anything you can do with HTML5 inside of one of these gadgets. It's basically just a small web page. So you could certainly do that. I guess the gadget would have to trigger first before you could do that. If you wanted to do it with like a gadget in the Gmail left nav, you could also do something like that too. Yeah.
Sorry, right now the example is using the webmail of Google Mail. If I'm using such a software like Outlook, and downloading through POP3 or any kind of protocol like that, would it be possible to add, for instance, some text at the end of a mail received according to the rules that I will code on the widgets?
I'm not sure if I understand your question. So
well, basically, let's say that I'm coding something which adds a text at the end of a mail received.
Okay.
And it works on the webmail.
Right.
Would it work if I download the mail through Outlook?
So the contextual gadget's not actually going to change anything about the email. It's just going to show up below. And so that's, it's going to be triggered based off of a match in that email message, and that match is only going to show up where contextual gadgets are available.
Oh, okay. I see.
Okay. So I'm going to quickly go through these live questions or moderator questions here. Does contextual gadgets can create Gmail filters? So right now, the only interaction with Gmail itself is displaying at the bottom of these email messages. It's not actually changing anything in Gmail. It's not changing setting. It's not changing filters or anything like that. So the answer for this one is no. Any way to store preferences or saving in the cloud instead? So I think in the context of gadgets, you are saving to the cloud if you save it in a gadget. And that would be the user prefs API that I was talking about before. And there's documentation on that if anyone's interested. When enabling a third-party gadget, can site admin limit the gadget's access to specific fields? So the domain administrator cannot basically deny parts of a request from a gadget. So it's basically all or nothing, right? You can decide to install a gadget that asks for the set of fields that it's asking for, or you can deny access to that gadget. So if the gadget is asking for every single field of the email message, it's appropriate to sort of wonder what the motivation is for doing that. But you can't basically do a line item veto. And the reason for that is basically, what if you eliminate a field that prevents or that keeps the gadget from working? So no, you can't do the one-off restrictions. It's basically yes or no. For apps domains, how can you deploy to a subset of users or user opt-out within the domain? So right now, you can only deploy to all of the users in a domain. And this is common feedback, so we're going to look at ways not only Google Apps or Gmail contextual gadgets can be restricted to certain users, but also everything in Google Apps that's installable via the marketplace. And I think that's it. So any more live questions? Yeah. OK, so this is basically the same as any other scope change inside of a Google Apps Marketplace application. So you would update your manifest and basically remove scopes or edit scopes or add scopes, whatever it is that you're interested in doing in particular. And then the domain administrator would need to go in and basically reapprove that change before it could take effect. Yep. Yeah.
How long before this is available to gmail.com?
Yes, I was waiting for someone to ask me that question. So unfortunately, we don't have a specific timeline on when this would be available to regular Gmail users. There's some things we have to think about before that can happen. And I unfortunately don't have a timeline. But I'm really excited about it, and I think it would be great to roll out to everyone. But that's just my opinion. So we'll see.
Going back to his question, if you change the scope, and then do you guys cache the app, or you just disable the app, or what happens if
right.
things have changed in the application, but the administrator doesn't get around to updating it for a week?
Right. So in the case of contextual gadgets, and one of the people in the audience can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe if you change the scopes requested by a contextual gadget, we would actually disable the contextual gadget. Is that correct? Yeah. Yeah.
If you have an existing extractor and you add new scopes to it, that extractor will stop working until the administrator approves it. The better way to do it would be to add a new extractor. So your
Right.
existing gadget keeps working as it's supposed to.
Right.
And you wait for approval from the administrator.
Right. So the best way to do it is basically like adding a new feature. So if you add a new feature to a Google Apps Marketplace app, the other features are still going to work. The new feature is just not going to be turned on yet. OK. Well, thank you all for coming. And yeah.